August 1959. Point Loma, California. A team of physicists gathers around a metal cylinder, about the size of a car, sitting on a desert launch pad. This is no ordinary rocket test. There's no fuel tank, no combustion chamber, no conventional engine of any kind. Instead, beneath this crude assembly of steel and shock absorbers sits something far more radical, a small explosive charge. The countdown reaches 0. The charge detonates. The cylinder rockets upward on a pillar of fire, riding the shockwave like a cosmic surfboard. It climbs. Then another explosion fires. Then another. 6 sequential blasts propel this primitive spacecraft skyward, each detonation a thunderclap of raw power. This is Project Orion's test vehicle, and it works. The math checks out. The concept is proven. America has just demonstrated that you can ride explosions into space. And if you scale up those explosions to nuclear weapons, you could reach Mars decades before any conventional rocket could dream of making the journey. But this story isn't about triumph. It's about betrayal. Because what happened next would delay human Mars exploration not by years, but by more than half a century. And the enemy wasn't physics or engineering or even money. The enemy was secrecy itself, wielded by the very government agencies that should have been NASA's greatest allies. This is the story of how America's most ambitious space program was killed, not by technical impossibility, but by institutional gatekeeping. How the dream of nuclear-powered spaceflight was strangled in its cradle by classification stamps and bureaucratic stonewalling. And how the narrative we've been told about why humans haven't reached Mars, that it's too hard, too expensive, too dangerous, is incomplete at best, and a deliberate misdirection at worst. The real story begins in 1960, in a conference room where one man dared to imagine a future that terrified as many people as it inspired. Wernher von Braun stands before a room of NASA administrators, his German accent still thick, his eyes burning with the fervor of a true believer. His reputation is already controversial. His past designing V-2 rockets for Nazi Germany casts a long shadow. But in this moment, he's not looking backward. He's staking everything on an idea so radical, it sounds like science fiction. Nuclear-powered rockets that could revolutionize space travel. Von Braun's argument is elegant in its simplicity. Chemical rockets, he explains, are fundamentally inadequate for interplanetary travel. They're hitting the ceiling of what's physically possible. You can only get so much energy out of burning hydrogen and oxygen together. The laws of chemistry impose hard limits on exhaust velocity, and those limits translate directly into how much payload you can carry and how fast you can go where missions to the moon. Chemical propulsion might suffice. Barely. But Mars? Mars is a different beast entirely. The distances are vast. The journey measured in months rather than days, and every kilogram of spacecraft requires kilograms of fuel, which requires more fuel to lift that fuel, in an exponential spiral that quickly becomes absurd. But nuclear propulsion, von Braun argues, changes everything. Instead of chemical energy, you're tapping into the binding forces that hold atomic nuclei together. Energy millions of times more concentrated than any chemical reaction. A nuclear thermal rocket works by running hydrogen propellant through a reactor core, heated to temperatures that would vaporize any chemical rocket engine. The superheated hydrogen screams out the nozzle at velocities chemical rockets simply cannot achieve. The efficiency gains are staggering. Where chemical rockets might achieve specific impulse values around 450 seconds, a measure of how much thrust you get per unit of propellant, nuclear thermal designs could reach 800, even 900 seconds. Nearly double the efficiency. Every kilogram of propellant pushes you twice as far. The implications cascade outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Shorter transit times mean less radiation exposure for astronauts. Less fuel mass means more payload capacity. More payload means better science, more robust life support, actual return capability instead of one-way missions. Von Braun's timeline is breathtaking. First crewed Mars landing within years of perfecting the technology. permanent bases following soon after the audience is captivated. This is the technical elegance that seduces engineers, the promise that makes careers and justifies budgets. But there's a problem von Braun doesn't yet understand, a trap hidden in the very foundation of his proposal. The nuclear data he needs to design these engines, reactor geometries, fuel enrichment specifications, neutron flux calculations, materials that can survive the hellish environment inside an operating reactor core. All of it is locked behind the highest levels of classification, controlled by an agency that doesn't answer to NASA and has very different priorities. The Atomic Energy Commission guards nuclear secrets the way a dragon guards gold, and they're about to make it very clear that space exploration is not a sufficient reason to share. But von Braun's nuclear thermal rockets, as ambitious as they were, represented the conservative approach. In the California desert, a team of physicists had an even more radical idea. One so powerful, so dangerous, it would make heating hydrogen in a reactor look downright conventional by comparison. Ted Taylor was a brilliant nuclear weapons designer at Los Alamos, a man who understood the destructive power of atomic bombs at a level few humans ever would. But Taylor became obsessed with a counterintuitive notion. What if nuclear weapons weren't just instruments of destruction? What if they could be vehicles of exploration? What if you could harness that terrible power not to destroy cities, but to lift humanity off this planet and carry us to other worlds? This was the genesis of Project Orion, and its core concept was audacious to the point of madness. Forget reactors and heated propellant. Orion would be propelled by nuclear bombs, actual atomic weapons detonated in rapid sequence behind a massive spacecraft. The ship would have a pusher plate, a shock-absorbing disc that would capture the force of each detonation and convert that raw nuclear fury into thrust. Each bomb would be ejected from the spacecraft, detonated at a precise distance, and the plasma fireball would slam into the pusher plate, driving the ship forward. Then another bomb, then another. A cosmic pogo stick riding atomic explosions into the void. It sounds insane. It sounds impossible. But the physics are actually quite sound. Nuclear explosions release energy in all directions, but if you detonate them at the right distance behind a massive plate, a significant fraction of that energy can be captured as directed thrust. The engineering challenges are formidable. You need shock absorbers capable of handling repeated hammer blows of nuclear force, materials that can survive being bathed in plasma and radiation, precise timing mechanisms to ensure bombs detonate at exactly the right moment and distance. But none of these challenges are insurmountable. They're engineering problems, not physics problems. And engineers solve problems. The hot rod test proved the concept worked. Using small conventional explosives rather than nuclear charges, Taylor's team successfully propelled a scale model. The shock absorption worked. The thrust calculations matched predictions. The design was viable. And when they scaled up the math to full-size nuclear charges, the capabilities were extraordinary. They envisioned spacecraft massing thousands of tons, dwarfing anything that could be launched by chemical rockets, capable of reaching Mars not in months, but in weeks. The sheer brute force of nuclear pulse propulsion overwhelmed the tyranny of the rocket equation that makes conventional space travel so difficult. Taylor's team calculated they could build this within 5 years using existing technology. No exotic materials required, no fundamental physics breakthroughs needed, just engineering, determination, and access to nuclear weapons. But as Taylor and his colleagues refined their designs, as they moved from proof of concept to detailed mission planning, they began to confront a terrible question. What would it cost? Not in dollars, but in lives. Because every Orion launch would scatter radioactive debris across the atmosphere, and someone would have to calculate how much. Freeman Dyson was the legendary physicist recruited to bring mathematical rigor to Orion's wild ambitions. Dyson was no stranger to difficult calculations or uncomfortable truths. But the fallout analysis he performed would haunt the project, and him, for decades. The math was unforgiving. Each Orion launch, each string of nuclear detonations propelling a spacecraft into orbit, would release radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. These particles would disperse globally, settling into soil and water, entering food chains, accumulating in human bodies. The radiation doses would be small, spread across the entire human population, but they would be real. And radiation, even in small doses, increases cancer risk. The relationship is statistical, probabilistic. You can't point to a specific person and say, "This launch killed you." But across millions or billions of people, the statistics become inexorable. Dyson's calculations suggested each Orion launch would cause between 1/10 and 1 death worldwide from radiation-induced cancer. A statistical death. A death that would happen years or decades later, untraceable to its source, but no less real for being invisible. The team grappled with this horror. Is one statistical death acceptable to open the solar system to humanity? What about 10 launches? 100? How do you weigh one invisible death against the potential for human civilization to become multiplanetary? The utilitarian calculus is staggering in its implications and deeply uncomfortable in its coldness. For Ted Taylor, the moral weight became personal in ways he couldn't have anticipated. This was a man who had designed nuclear weapons, who had drawn blast radius circles on maps, who understood destruction at scales most humans can barely conceive. But understanding destruction in the abstract is different from confronting it in the particular. The documentary evidence shows Taylor wrestling with the dual nature of nuclear technology, its potential for both transcendence and tragedy, and finding no easy answers. The team debated, they calculated, they hoped they'd made errors in the fallout analysis. They hadn't. The math was sound. Each launch would kill someone, somewhere, someday. The question was whether that price was worth paying. But before they could even resolve that moral crisis, before the ethical debate could reach any conclusion, a different threat emerged. The Atomic Energy Commission, the gatekeepers of all nuclear knowledge in America, began stonewalling their requests for critical data. The AEC controlled everything related to nuclear technology: weapons designs, reactor specifications, fissile material properties, radiation effects, neutron cross-sections. Everything NASA needed to design nuclear propulsion systems, whether Orion's pulse propulsion or von Braun's thermal rockets, was classified at levels that required AEC approval to access. And the AEC was not inclined to cooperate. NASA submitted formal requests for declassification of specific technical data. They needed reactor designs. They needed fuel specifications. They needed materials data for components that would operate in extreme radiation environments. They made their case. This was for peaceful space exploration, for advancing human knowledge, for winning the space race against the Soviet Union. Surely national pride and scientific progress justified sharing this information with America's civilian space agency. The AEC responded with delays. They requested additional safety studies. They demanded environmental impact assessments. They raised concerns about nuclear proliferation. If NASA published detailed nuclear rocket designs, what would stop other nations from adapting them for weapons? The questions multiplied faster than NASA could answer them, and behind each answer came new questions, an infinite regress of bureaucratic obstruction. Behind closed doors, AEC officials expressed genuine fears. Nuclear technology in space represented a Pandora's box they weren't sure should be opened. Military and intelligence officials worried about normalizing nuclear systems in space. If civilian spacecraft routinely use nuclear propulsion, would that make it easier for adversaries to develop nuclear weapons in orbit? Would detailed reactor designs published in NASA technical reports provide blueprints for weapons programs in non-nuclear states? The concerns weren't entirely without merit, but they were applied selectively and often served as convenient excuses for institutional turf guarding. In 1963, the AEC formally denied NASA's declassification requests. The stated reasons were vague. National security concerns that they refused to specify in detail. NASA's engineers realized they'd been outmaneuvered. Without the classified data, they couldn't design flight-ready reactors. They couldn't calculate precise fuel requirements. they couldn't prove to Congress that the programs were feasible and worth funding. The AEC had effectively killed nuclear propulsion without ever having to argue against it on technical merits. But NASA didn't give up entirely. If the radical pulse propulsion of Orion was too controversial, perhaps a more conservative approach would fare better. Enter NERVA, the nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application. NERVA was von Braun's vision made tangible, a nuclear thermal rocket that would heat hydrogen propellant to extreme temperatures and expel it through a conventional nozzle. It was less exotic than Orion, less threatening, more palatable to both the AEC and the public. And for a while, it seemed to work. In the Nevada desert, Aerojet engineers worked around the clock testing reactor cores. These weren't paper studies or theoretical designs. These were real nuclear reactors, glowing white-hot, pumping superheated hydrogen through test stands. Between 1964 and 1973, the NERVA program successfully tested multiple reactor configurations. The engines achieved the predicted performance. They ran for extended durations. They proved the concept viable. For engineers who had dedicated years to this work, who had solved problem after problem, who had made nuclear thermal propulsion a demonstrated reality rather than a dream, it must have felt like vindication. But the AEC continued to restrict access to advanced reactor designs and high-enrichment uranium specifications. NASA could demonstrate proof of concept with test articles built under AEC supervision, but they couldn't access the detailed data needed to design a flight-rated system that could be manufactured and operated independently. The AEC maintained control, maintained their gatekeeping role, maintained the classification barriers that prevented NASA from truly owning the technology. And then, in 1972, despite successful tests and billions of dollars invested, NERVA was canceled. The official reason given was budget cuts following the Apollo program. NASA's funding was being slashed. The space shuttle was consuming available resources. Mars missions were being pushed into an indefinite future. NERVA, however promising, was a casualty of fiscal reality. But that official explanation obscures a deeper truth. The AEC had never intended to let NASA have unfettered access to weapons-grade nuclear technology. The restrictions, the classifications, the endless bureaucratic obstacles, these weren't temporary hurdles to be overcome. They were features, not bugs. The institutional resistance to civilian nuclear spaceflight was baked into the system from the beginning. The cancellation of NERVA in 1972 marked the end of America's first nuclear space age. The test engines were buried in Nevada, too radioactive to move, too classified to study. The engineers dispersed to other projects or retired, taking their hard-won expertise with them. The institutional knowledge began to fade, and the consequences of that bureaucratic betrayal would echo for decades. Fast forward through the years that followed. The 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. NASA conducts study after study of potential Mars missions, and everyone reaches the same conclusion. With chemical propulsion alone, a human Mars mission would be extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily expensive, and extraordinarily risky. The transit times would be measured in months each way. The fuel requirements would be massive. The cosmic radiation exposure during the long journey would push the boundaries of acceptable risk for astronauts' mission. Cost estimates balloon into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Mars remains tantalizingly out of reach, not because we don't know how to get there, but because the conventional tools at our disposal make it prohibitively hard. Meanwhile, the nuclear data remains classified. Younger engineers, unaware of the history, occasionally rediscover the old NERVA reports and Orion studies. They read about nuclear propulsion's potential with fresh eyes and think, why aren't we doing this? Why are we still struggling with the same propulsion limitations that could have been solved 40 years ago? And then they run into the same classification walls, the same bureaucratic resistance, the same institutional inertia that killed the programs in the first place. Former NERVA engineers, interviewed in their later years, speak with barely concealed bitterness about what might have been. They held the keys to Mars. They proved the technology worked. They solved the engineering challenges. And then they watched as political decisions and bureaucratic gatekeeping buried everything they'd accomplished. The frustration is palpable, not just at careers cut short or projects canceled, but at the lost decades of human exploration, at the Mars bases that could have existed by now, at the scientific discoveries that could have been made, at the expansion of human civilization into the solar system that was delayed by institutional failure rather than technical impossibility. And here's the final twist, the irony that makes this entire story even more frustrating. The nuclear secrets that the AEC guarded so jealously? Many of them weren't actually secret at all, at least not from America's adversaries. In the post-Cold War era, as archives opened and documents were declassified, intelligence analysts made a startling discovery. The Soviet Union had been developing their own nuclear propulsion programs throughout the same period. They had their own nuclear thermal rocket designs. They had conducted their own tests. They had faced similar technical challenges and arrived at similar solutions. The proliferation risk that the AEC cited as justification for classification, the fear that detailed nuclear rocket designs would enable weapons programs in other nations, was largely a phantom. The major nuclear powers were pursuing this technology independently. The physics was accessible to anyone with sufficient expertise. Many of the principles the AEC kept classified were already published in open physics literature, or could be derived from first principles by competent scientists. The real motivation for classification appears to have been institutional control and military concerns about civilian access to nuclear technology, rather than any genuine security benefit. And the AEC's successor agencies, the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, maintained the classification framework even after the Cold War ended, creating bureaucratic inertia that persists to this day. Think about what this means. If the AEC had cooperated with NASA in the 1960s, if they had prioritized human space exploration alongside weapons development and national security, humans might have reached Mars by the mid-1970s. We might have had permanent bases on Mars by the 1980s. An entire generation of exploration and discovery was lost, not to technical impossibility or lack of funding, but to institutional gatekeeping and the deliberate withholding of information. We're still living with the consequences of those decisions. In 2024, NASA is planning human Mars missions using technology that is, conceptually, similar to what von Braun proposed 60 years ago. We're still struggling with the same propulsion limitations that nuclear systems could have solved decades ago. The timeline for human Mars exploration has been pushed back not by years, but by more than half a century. And yet, there are glimmers of hope. Modern nuclear propulsion research is experiencing a renaissance. New reactor designs, new materials, new approaches to nuclear thermal and nuclear electric propulsion are being developed. Some of the old classification barriers are finally being relaxed. A new generation of engineers is rediscovering what the Orion and Nerva teams proved in the 1960s. Nuclear propulsion works, and it could revolutionize deep space exploration. But we've lost 50 years. 50 years of exploration. 50 years of discovery. 50 years of human expansion into the solar system. All because of decisions made in classified meetings by officials who prioritized institutional control over human progress. The hot rod test in 1959 proved we could ride nuclear explosions into space. The Nerva tests in the 1960s and early 1970s proved nuclear thermal rockets could work. The engineers solved the problems. The physics checked out. The technology was real. And then bureaucracy killed it, not with a dramatic confrontation or a clear villain, but with classification stamps and denial letters and endless requests for additional studies. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. This is the story we should remember when we finally send humans to Mars. Not just the triumph of getting there, but the tragedy of how long it took. Not just the engineers who made it possible, but the engineers whose work was buried and forgotten. Not just the technical challenges we overcame, but the institutional failures that delayed us for generations. Because the biggest obstacle to human Mars exploration was never physics or engineering or even money. It was secrecy itself, wielded by bureaucrats who couldn't see past their classification stamps to the future they were stealing from us all. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more stories where history, technology, and human ambition collide. Thanks for watching.